The recruitment parade came to Foundry District 7 on a Thrones Day, when the smog was thick enough to hide the sun but not thick enough to hide the banners. Golden Aquilus, on crimson cloth, held high by men in dress uniforms so clean they seemed to glow against our perpetual grime. Behind them marched a choir of children from the Schola Progenium, their voices pure and high, singing hymns about duty and glory that echoed off the hab block walls like promises. I was standing in line for corpstarch rations with my younger brother Mikhail when they arrived. The queue dissolved instantly, 300 factory workers abandoning their pitiful food to watch something that wasn't gray, wasn't broken, wasn't dying. The recruitment sergeant stood on a makeshift platform constructed from ammunition crates, his voice amplified through speakers that turned his words into thunder. Citizens of Mordia, the Emperor calls for heroes. The Imperium needs your strength, your courage, your willing hearts. Join the Astra Militarum and become more than you are. Become the shield of humanity itself. Michael grabbed my arm, his 16-year-old face bright with something I hadn't seen since our parents died in the reactor breach. Hope. Around us, others were pushing forward, hands reaching toward the recruitment table where clerks had materialized with data slates and contracts. The sergeant continued his sermon, each word calculated to pierce through decades of industrial despair. You work in darkness, you toil for scraps. But in the guard, you'll stand in the Emperor's light. Regular meals, proper equipment, wages sent home to support your families. And when you return, for you will return. Victorious, you'll be heroes of the Imperium, with honors that will elevate your bloodline for generations. The lies came wrapped in such beautiful packaging that we swallowed them whole. I signed first. The contract was 40 pages of text, so small my eyes watered trying to read it. But the clerk said it was standard, nothing to worry about, just provisions for equipment, length of service, compensation. Michael tried to sign after me, but they rejected him too young by 6 months. He begged, actually got on his knees in the industrial sludge that passed for ground, but the recruiter just marked his name for future consideration and moved to the next volunteer. They gave us 12 hours to settle our affairs. I spent them trying to convince Michael that staying was better, that someone needed to maintain our HAB unit, keep our parents' memory alive. He spent them in silence, looking at me like I'd betrayed him by being born first, by being old enough to escape while he remained trapped. The morning of departure, 700 of us gathered at the transit platform. Some brought families to see them off, elderly parents weeping into rough hands, children too young to understand why their fathers were leaving, wives and husbands exchanging final kisses that tasted of ash and unspoken fear. Others, like me, came alone. Michael had refused to see me off, locking himself in our HAB's single room while I gathered my possessions into the canvas bag they'd issued us. The transport that would take us to the troop ship was a converted cargo hauler, its sides still stained with promethium residue and its floor sticky with substances I chose not to identify. We were packed in standing room only, shoulders pressed against strangers who would become brothers in misery soon enough. The smell was immediate and overwhelming: unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and the sour reek of industrial workers who'd never known clean air. Through gaps in the hauler's walls, I watched Mordia shrink below us. The foundries looked like infected wounds from above, belching smoke that formed a permanent ceiling over our world. The HAB blocks stretched to every horizon, endless rectangular tumors growing from the planet's skin. For the first time in my life, I saw the actual sky above the smog layer, a pale, sickly yellow that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so alien. The void-capable troop ship waited in high orbit, like a metal mountain floating in nothing. The Castellan's Resolve, they called it, though I'd later learn guard ships were renamed constantly as their previous iterations were destroyed and replaced. It was 16 kilometers long, its hull pocked with weapon batteries and scarred from battles that had happened before I was born. The recruitment sergeant had shown us pics of glorious battleships with golden prows and pristine armor. This was not that ship. We docked in a cargo bay that could have held our entire HAB block. The transition from hauler to ship happened so fast that many of us stumbled, unused to the gravity fluctuations. They herded us through corridors that sweated condensation, past pipes that leaked steam hot enough to blister exposed skin, into a processing chamber where our transformation from citizens to soldiers began. Strip, commanded a Medicae orderly who looked like she'd been awake for 70 hours. No explanation, no privacy screens, just 700 people fumbling with clothes while servitors collected them for incineration. We stood naked under lights that revealed every scar, every malformation, every secret our bodies held. The Medicae staff moved through us, like farmers inspecting livestock, marking some for additional screening, sending others directly to the next station. The boy beside me, couldn't have been more than 17, was pulled aside when they found tumors growing along his spine. He protested that he felt fine, that he could work, that he needed this chance. They sedated him and dragged him away. We never saw him again, though I later found his name, Davros Kell, already marked as Kia in the rolls. They'd rather list us as battlefield casualties than training failures. Decontamination came next. Chemical showers that burned away the top layer of skin, along with whatever organisms we'd carried from Mordia. The solution turned my hair white in patches and left chemical burns that took weeks to heal. A woman ahead of me screamed when it hit her eyes, thrashing against the servitors that held her in place until the cycle completed. When it was over, she couldn't see. They marked her for alternative service and took her away, her hands stretched out in front of her, feeling for walls that kept moving. They issued us uniforms while we were still dripping chemicals. Gray-green fabric that felt like sandpaper, boots that had been worn by dead men, helmets with names scratched into the inside, Castellan, Vasquez, Chen, a roster of ghosts we were replacing. My uniform had brown stains on the chest that wouldn't come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. The armory sergeant laughed when I asked for a clean one. "That's your motivation, boy. Remember what happened to the last wearer and try to do better." The last gun they handed me was older than my grandfather would have been. Its power pack was held in place with adhesive tape, and the barrel had been welded back together at least twice. When I tested the charge, it read 30%. They told me that was standard, that full charges were for veterans who'd proven they wouldn't waste shots. The weapon felt wrong in my hands, too heavy and too light simultaneously, like holding someone else's death. They assigned us to Barracks Deck 47C, a converted cargo hold with bunks stacked 4 high in rows that stretched beyond the flickering lumens. The air recyclers worked intermittently, leaving us breathing each other's exhaust half the time. The bunks were metal slabs with foam that had compressed to nothing, and we were issued one blanket that smelled of sulfur and old blood. Privacy didn't exist. The latrines were open rows of holes, the showers were group affairs with water that ran brown, and the only personal space was the 40 centimeters of bunk width. That first night, they fed us. The recruitment sergeant had promised regular meals, and technically he hadn't lied. We got them regularly once every 20 hours, a bowl of protein paste that had the consistency of engine grease and tasted like it had already been digested once. The veterans on the ship called it Corpse Starch Plus, claiming it was improved from what we'd eaten on Mordia, because it sometimes had identifiable chunks. I found what might have been a fingernail in mine, and decided not to look too closely after that. A man named Harkin bunked below me, a factory worker from the same district who'd signed up to escape debt collectors. He talked constantly that first night, nervous chatter about his plans for his guard wages, how he'd send them home to his wife, pay off the creditors, maybe even save enough to buy their way into a better hab block. I let him talk, even though I knew we all knew that those wages would never materialize, that his wife would receive only a death notice and a fraction of what he'd been promised. The void jump happened without warning on the third day. One moment we were in real space, the next reality twisted inside out. The Geller fields held, but barely. We could feel the pressure of the warp against them, like being deep underwater with something massive swimming just outside your vision. Men screamed in their bunks, clawing at their eyes, claiming they could see things moving in the walls. The lights failed repeatedly, leaving us in darkness that felt alive, malevolent, hungry. During one of these blackouts, someone started cutting throats. We didn't know who. The darkness was absolute, and the screaming blended with the ambient nightmares of warp travel. Bodies were discovered when the lights returned, neat slices across jugulars, blood pooling in the grooves of the deck plating. The sergeants blamed it on warp madness, said it happened sometimes, that the weak-minded broke under translation. But the cuts were too precise, too practiced. Someone among us had been a killer before they joined, and the warp had given them permission to practice their craft. They called it training on the 4th day. A drill sergeant whose face was more augmetic than flesh lined us up in a cargo bay and began screaming instructions that contradicted themselves. March forward, but stay in place. Present arms with weapons we didn't have. Form firing lines while blindfolded. Anyone who failed was beaten with shock mauls until they learned that success meant guessing what the sergeant wanted rather than following orders. Combat is chaos, he screamed, spittle flying from the organic half of his mouth. Orders will be wrong, equipment will fail, your brothers will die. You adapt, or you decorate the battlefield with your intestines. He taught us to fire our lasguns by having us shoot at each other. Not to kill, the power settings were supposedly reduced to training levels. But training level still meant burns that went to the bone, still meant men collapsing with hearts stuttering from electrical discharge. We formed opposing lines and fired on command, learning to stand still while lost bolts seared past our heads, learning that flinching meant punishment, that taking cover meant execution for cowardice. Harkin took a shot to the shoulder that liquefied part of his deltoid. The medici sprayed it with counterseptic and sent him back to the line, his arm hanging useless, still expected to fire with his offhand. He missed more than he hit after that, and each miss earned him another shock from the sergeant's maul. By the session's end, he was unconscious, dragged back to barracks by two of us who'd been randomly selected for the duty. Physical training consisted of running through the ship's maintenance tunnels while wearing full kit. The tunnels were narrow enough that we had to move single file, hot enough that men passed out from heat exhaustion, filled with steam vents that would activate without warning. The sergeant followed behind the slowest runner with an auto pistol, firing shots that sparked off the tunnel walls, reminding us that stopping meant more than exhaustion, it meant death. We lost 12 men in those tunnels over the course of the voyage. 3 to steam vents that cooked them inside their uniforms. 4 to falls down maintenance shafts when exhaustion made them miss their footing. 5 to the sergeant's auto pistol when they simply couldn't run anymore. Each death was logged as training accident, acceptable losses, and their bunks were filled with conscripts from other barracks before their bodies had cooled. Combat doctrine classes were held in a repurposed chapel, the Aquila above the altar brown with old blood no one had bothered to clean. A lieutenant missing both legs below the knees would wheel himself in and lecture us on tactics that assumed we had equipment we'd never see, support we'd never receive, and competence we'd never achieve. He taught us formation names in High Gothic that none of us spoke, showed us tactical maps of battlefields that looked nothing like what we'd actually face, and tested us on information that would be useless the moment we made planetfall. The one useful thing he taught us was how to die properly. When you're hit, he said, his voice flat as a flat-lined medical monitor, you keep fighting. Gut shot. You have minutes before blood loss takes you, spend them killing. Lost a limb? You have another hand, use it. Blinded? Spray fire in the direction of enemy sounds. The Astra Militarum's greatest weapon isn't tactics or technology. It's the fact that we keep killing even while we're dying. We were 3 weeks into the voyage when they told us our destination, Vraks. A name that meant nothing to us then, that would mean everything to the few who survived. They said it was a simple compliance action, that Cardinal Zaffin had raised a rebellion that would be crushed within months. They showed us pics of the Fortress World massive defensive lines, weapon emplacements that could target orbit, millions of traitors dug in behind ceramite and ferrocrete. Months. Harkin whispered that night, his arm finally starting to heal wrong, twisted at an angle that would never be right. They said months. I wanted to tell him about the date on the pics, how they were already 3 years old, how a rebellion that took months to crush wouldn't need ships full of barely trained conscripts. But hope was the only thing keeping him functional, and I wasn't cruel enough to take it away. Not yet. The final week of the voyage, they started what they called acclimatization. They turned off the heat in our barracks, letting us freeze in the void, cold metal. They reduced our rations to 1 meal every 30 hours. They piped recordings of combat through the speakers, screaming, explosions, the wet sounds of bodies being taken apart by weapons we couldn't identify. Sleep became impossible. Eating became an ordeal. Existing became an endurance test. You think war will be worse than this? The sergeant screamed during our final training session. War is a vacation compared to disappointment. And you will all disappoint. You'll disappoint your officers, your emperor, your mothers who wasted their lives birthing you. The enemy will be disappointed by how easily you die. Your corpses will disappoint the worms that have to choke down your worthless flesh. They had us practice dying. Literally. We would lie in formation pretending to be casualties, while others stepped over us, learning not to help the wounded, not to stop for the dying, to keep advancing over the carpet of our brothers' bodies. I lay there, eyes closed, feeling boots step on my chest, my hands, my face, understanding that this wasn't training for combat, it was training us to be obstacles our replacements would navigate. The night before we reached Vraks, they held what they called a motivational assembly. They packed all 700 of us, minus the 83, who died during voyage, into the chapel, and showed us picked feeds of what awaited. Not propaganda reels of glory, but actual combat footage from the first 3 years of the siege. Mountains of corpses, trenches full of mud mixed with human remains, men drowning in their own blood. Artillery barrages that turned battalions into mist. "This is your future," the lieutenant said, his wheelchair squeaking as he moved. "Most of you will die in the first week. Those who survive will wish they hadn't. But you'll hold the line, because that's what the Guard does. We hold the line with our bodies, our blood, our bones if necessary. The Imperium doesn't need heroes. It needs corpses that slow the enemy down." That night the throat cutter struck again. 4 more dead, their blood forming words on the barracks floor. Mercy. The sergeants didn't even investigate this time, just had servitors mop up the blood and stack the bodies with the training casualties. We were close enough to Vraks that individual deaths had stopped mattering. I couldn't sleep that final night, so I climbed to an observation port that hadn't been sealed properly. Through the grimy transparisteel, I could see Vraks growing larger, a brown ball scarred with the geometric precision of trenches visible from orbit. Ships surrounded it like flies on a corpse, disgorging landing craft that fell like rain toward the surface. Explosions bloomed constantly across the planet's face, brief flowers of light that marked the deaths of hundreds. Behind me, someone whispered, "We're not reinforcements." I turned to find a woman from another barracks, her face gaunt from the voyage, her eyes holding the kind of clarity that comes right before madness or acceptance. "We're not reinforcements," she repeated. "We're ammunition. They're going to fire us at the enemy and hope we do some damage before we're spent." She was right, of course. But knowing it and accepting it were different things. I thought of Michael, probably lying in our hab bunk, hating me for leaving, not knowing I'd saved him by going first. By the time he was old enough to recruit, I'd be dead, and maybe my death notice would be enough to convince him to hide when the next recruitment parade came through. The drop siren started at 300, ship time. We had 6 minutes to gear up, form ranks, and march to the drop bays. Men fumbled with equipment in the dark, some still drunk on the rot-gut alcohol someone had distilled from engine coolant. Others prayed, kissing Aquila pendants or muttering half-remembered catechisms. Harkin just sat on his bunk, staring at his twisted arm, understanding finally setting in. "I'm not going home, am I?" he asked no one in particular. No one answered. We all knew the answer. The drop bay was chaos. Dozens of landers lined up, their ramps down like hungry mouths. Officers screamed contradictory orders. Sergeants beat anyone who moved too slowly. The bay speakers crackled with reports from the surface, heavy casualties in Sector 7, reinforcements critical at Grid 99, estimated 60% losses on landing. They assigned us to Lander 773. The name stenciled on its side had been painted over so many times it was illegible, a palimpsest of all the units that had ridden it to their deaths. Inside, the walls were scratched with last messages, names, prayers, confessions, and over again, variations of, "We were lied to." The pilot's voice crackled through the comm. "Secure for drop. Surface conditions are hot. Expected resistance is total. Emperor protects." As the lander detached from the ship, I felt my stomach rise into my throat. Through a small port, I could see other landers falling alongside us, hundreds of them. A rain of metal coffins carrying 18-year-olds with 3 weeks of training into a war that had already devoured 3 years' worth of 18-year-olds. The recruitment sergeant had been right about one thing: we would be heroes. Not because we'd accomplish anything heroic, but because heroes were what the Imperium called corpses that died where they were told to. And we were about to become extremely heroic. The lander shook as it hit atmosphere, the heat of entry making the walls glow cherry red. Men vomited from the motion. Others voided themselves from fear. The smell mixed with the burning metal and ozone to create an atmosphere that was uniquely guard the perfume of the condemned approaching their execution. Through the chaos, I heard Harkin laughing. Not mad laughter, but the genuine humor of someone who finally understood the joke. They promised us glory, he gasped between laughs. And they're going to deliver. We're about to become so glorious, the most glorious corpses Vraks has ever seen. Anti-aircraft fire started hitting us 30 seconds before landing. The lander bucked and rolled, throwing us against our restraints hard enough to crack ribs. Through the ports, I saw another lander take a direct hit and simply cease there one moment, gone the next. Its 100 occupants translated instantly from recruits to memory. The pilot was screaming something about brace positions, but his voice cut out mid-word. The lander's controlled descent became a barely controlled crash. We hit the surface of Vraks like a meteor, the impact crushing the 2 front rows of seats and the men in them into a compressed mass of metal and meat. The ramp blown off on impact, and through the opening, I saw my first glimpse of actual war. It looked nothing like the recruitment posters. The ramp was gone, blown off by the impact, and through that jagged metal mouth I saw hell wearing Vraks' name. The air itself was brown, not sky, not ground, just a uniform brown made of dust, smoke, and vaporized earth that hung like a curtain between us and whatever was shooting at us. The sound hit next, not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that made thought impossible, made orders meaningless, made everything except moving forward an abstraction. A sergeant I'd never seen before appeared at the opening, his face a mask of blood from a scalp wound that had painted everything below his eyes red. He grabbed the nearest trooper and threw him out of the lander. Then the next, creating a chain of bodies tumbling into the brown nothing. When he reached me, his hand was slick with other people's blood, and his grip slipped. That half-second of failed contact saved my life. The man he grabbed instead of me took 3 steps outside before an artillery shell deleted him from existence. I jumped out myself rather than wait to be thrown, landing on ground that wasn't ground but a mixture of mud, chemical runoff, and the liquefied remains of previous waves. My boots sank immediately to the ankles, and when I tried to move, the suction nearly pulled them off. Around me, others from the lander were struggling with the same problem, some falling face first into the muck, their las guns disappearing into the soup of Vraks' surface. Through the brown haze, I could make out shapes, the geometric lines of trenches cutting across the landscape like infected wounds, bunkers that squatted like tumors on rises of land, and between them, a moonscape of craters filled with water that reflected the orange of constant fires. Bodies floated in those craters, so many that you could walk across them like bridges if you didn't mind the way they shifted under your weight. The sergeant was screaming something, his words lost in the ambient roar, but his gestures were clear enough forward, toward the trenches that our intelligence had said were lightly defended by demoralized traitors. The intelligence was wrong about everything except the direction. We ran, or tried to run, through mud that grabbed at our legs like it was alive and hungry. Harkin was beside me, his twisted arm making him list to one side, his lasgun held awkwardly in his offhand. A woman whose name I never learned ran on my other side, her mouth open in what might have been a scream or just an attempt to breathe in air that was more particulate than gas. The first artillery barrage hit when we were 20 meters from the lander. The shells didn't whistle. That was propaganda. They shrieked, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primitive parts of the brain that understood death was coming. The training sergeant had told us to throw ourselves flat when we heard incoming, but the mud made that irrelevant. Those who dove down sank and drowned. Those who stayed upright were shredded by shrapnel or simply disappeared when shells landed close enough. I kept running because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding that we were all dead, just at different stages of the process. The enemy revealed themselves when we were 50 meters from their trenches, not the demoralized traitors we'd been promised, but Vraksian militia who'd spent 3 years turning their world into a masterpiece of killing fields. They rose from concealed positions like the earth itself had grown soldiers, their faces hidden behind gas masks that made them look like insects, their autoguns already chattering before they'd fully stood. The woman beside me folded in half as autogun rounds punched through her flak armor like it was paper. Her forward momentum carried her several steps before she realized she was dead, her legs continuing to pump even as her torso hung backward at an impossible angle. Harkin screamed something that might have been a prayer or a curse and fired his lasgun wildly, the beam going nowhere near any target but at least announcing that we were fighting back. My own lasgun felt like a toy in my hands as I raised it, the iron sights shaking so badly I couldn't line them up. I pulled the trigger anyway, sending scarlet beams into the brown nothing, hoping statistics would favor me and hit something. The power pack drained after 12 shots, the 30% charge, lasting exactly as long as they'd planned, just enough to make us feel like soldiers before reminding us we were targets. The Vraksians' fire was disciplined, methodical. They worked in teams, one squad suppressing while another advanced, textbook tactics executed by men who'd had 3 years to perfect them. Our response was chaos conscripts firing in every direction, some shooting their own comrades in the back, others throwing their empty lasguns at the enemy, as if they were clubs that could cross 50 meters of open ground. An officer appeared from nowhere, or maybe he'd always been there, and I just noticed him when he started screaming. He was waving a chainsword that wasn't running because its power pack had been shattered by shrapnel, using it as a particularly awkward club to beat conscripts who weren't advancing fast enough. "Forward, forward, you dogs! The Emperor demands your sacrifice." Someone shot him. Not the enemy, one of ours. A last bolt through the back of his skull that dropped him mid-word. In the chaos, no one investigated. Officers died on Vraks at a rate that made their life expectancy measurable in hours. This one had lasted 6 minutes from landing, which made him a veteran by our standards. We reached the trenches through sheer mathematics. They could only kill so many of us per second, and we had more bodies than they had seconds. The first man to reach the lip of the trench was a giant from the agri-worlds, 2.5 meters of muscle that had probably made him valuable for harvest work. He looked down into the trench, raised his lasgun, and then his head disappeared in a cloud of pink mist as a Vraksian sniper demonstrated the difference between 3 weeks of training and 3 years of practice. I went over the top right after him, using his falling body as a shield, tumbling into the trench on top of a Vraksian militiaman who was trying to reload his autogun. We ended up tangled together in the mud at the trench's bottom, him trying to bring his knife around while I tried to remember the combat training that had consisted mainly of being beaten until we stopped flinching. The knife went into my side, sliding between ribs with surprisingly little resistance. The pain was less than I'd expected. A cold sensation followed by warmth that spread across my flak armor. I grabbed his wrist with one hand and pushed my thumb into his eye with the other, a technique I'd learned not from the guard but from gang fights in the hab blocks. The eye burst like a rotten fruit, and his scream was muffled by his gas mask as he jerked back, giving me enough space to grab his knife and return it to him through the soft spot under his jaw. He died on top of me, his weight pressing the knife deeper into my side, his blood mixing with mine in the mud that formed the trench's floor. I lay there for a moment, trapped under a corpse, watching boots run past at the trench's lip, listening to the sounds of combat that had become intimate rather than distant, the wet sounds of blades and flesh, the crack of point-blank loss fire, the gurgling of men drowning in their own blood. Harkin pulled me free, his twisted arm somehow finding enough strength to haul the dead Vraksian off me. His face was splattered with blood and brain matter, his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare that usually took months to develop but Vraks could grant in minutes. He didn't say anything, just pushed a half-empty power pack into my hand and pointed down the trench where the fighting was thickest. The trench was nothing like the clean, organized fortifications they'd shown us in training. It was a wound in the earth, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, filled knee-deep with water that had the consistency of gruel and the smell of rotting meat. The walls were reinforced with whatever was available: sheets of metal, sandbags, corpses that had been there so long they'd become structural elements. Every few meters there were fighting positions carved into the walls, each one a potential ambush point. We advanced through it in a mob, no formation, no tactics, just forward momentum and desperation. The Vraksians had fallen back to secondary positions, turning each corner into a killing field. They had grenades, real ones, not the training dummies we'd thrown once each. The explosions in the confined space of the trench turned men into aerosol, coating everyone nearby in a fine mist of their comrades. I watched a man try to throw a grenade back and have it explode in his hand, his arm disappearing up to the elbow, leaving him staring at the stump with an expression of puzzlement before he sat down in the muddy water and quietly bled out. Another tried to climb out of the trench to flank an enemy position and was cut in half by a heavy stubber, his lower body remaining standing for a moment before toppling backward into the men behind him. The medici support we'd been promised consisted of one field medic who'd survived the landing, a woman whose medical training had apparently been, "You look like you can hold a bandage." She was trying to treat a chest wound with gauze and prayer when a mortar round landed directly on her position. What remained wouldn't have filled a ration can. Those too wounded to walk were left where they fell. Those who could walk but couldn't fight were pushed forward anyway, used as human shields by those behind them. I saw a man with his intestines held in by his own hands pushed ahead of a squad, his gray-pink organs bulging between his fingers as he stumbled forward, absorbing autogun rounds meant for the men using him as cover. A commissar appeared at some point. They always did, like carrion birds drawn to suffering. This one was young, probably on his first deployment, his uniform still clean except for the mud that was unavoidable. He was shooting men for cowardice, which on Vraks meant anything from running away to not running forward fast enough. He shot a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 for crying, shot another for trying to bandage his own wound instead of advancing, shot a third for the crime of being the closest target when he needed to make an example. Forward, dogs. Your lives are the Emperor's currency, and he demands you spend them. Someone fragged him with a grenade that may or may not have been thrown at the enemy initially. In the chaos of the trench, friendly fire was so common it had stopped being notable. We stepped over his legs, the only parts of him substantial enough to remain, and kept advancing. The Vraksians had turned sections of the trench into nightmare mazes. False walls that looked solid until you tried to use them for cover and found they were cloth-painted to look like metal. Real walls with murder holes barely visible until the barrels of autoguns emerged. Floors that gave way to punji pits filled with industrial waste that burned through flak armor and flesh with equal efficiency. Every meter forward cost us men, and we were running out of men faster than we were gaining meters. By the time we reached what someone optimistically called an objective, a bunker that commanded views of 3 trench lines, I'd lost count of how many had died just in our section. The bunker was supposed to be taken by specialized assault troops with demo charges and training. Instead, it was us, conscripts with empty lasguns and whatever weapons we'd taken from the dead. The assault was simplicity itself. We ran at it until enough of us were dead that the survivors could climb the pile of corpses high enough to reach the firing slits. I was in the third wave, climbing over men who were still alive but too wounded to move, their hands grabbing at my boots, whether for help or to pull me down with them I couldn't tell. The Vraksian's heavy stubber was heating up from continuous fire, its barrel glowing cherry red, the snow around the bunker turning to steam that mixed with the smoke of burning bodies. A man ahead of me made it to the firing slit and shoved his lasgun through, firing point blank. The Vraksians inside pulled him through the slit up to his waist, and I heard his muffled screams as they took him apart with knives on the other side. His legs kept kicking for 30 seconds after the screaming stopped. Someone I never saw who finally thought to use a grenade. The explosion inside the confined space of the bunker turned its contents into paste, which leaked out through the firing slits like the bunker was bleeding. We counted it as captured, though no one wanted to go inside to confirm. The smell that came from within was enough confirmation that nothing lived in there anymore. The Voxcaster crackled with victory announcements. We'd taken 800 meters of trench at the cost of 3,000 lives. Command called it a significant tactical achievement and ordered us to prepare for the counterattack they somehow hadn't anticipated. The counterattack came at dusk, though on Vraks the distinction between day and night was largely academic. The sky was always brown, always lit by fires, always full of death. The Vraksians didn't just want their trenches back, they wanted to punish us for taking them. They came with flamers that turned the confined spaces into ovens, with combat engineers who collapsed entire sections with demolition charges, with veterans who knew every inch of the trench system they'd spent years building. We held for 6 hours, not through courage or skill, but through the simple arithmetic of having nowhere to retreat to. Behind us was open ground swept by our own army's guns to prevent desertion. Ahead was the enemy. The only choice was which direction to die in. I ended up in a section of trench with 12 others, including Harkin. We'd run out of lost packs hours ago, and were fighting with captured autoguns that jammed constantly from the mud. The Vraxian who led the assault on our section was wearing carapace armor that our weapons couldn't penetrate, walking through our fire like it was rain. He had a chainsword that actually worked, its teeth whirring as it carved through 3 men before we managed to bring him down by collectively tackling him and holding him under the muddy water until he drowned. As he died, he laughed. Through his helmet's Vox grill, I could hear him laughing, even as his lungs filled with mud. When we pulled his helmet off, his face was scarred but serene, like a man who'd finally heard the punchline to a joke he'd been waiting 3 years to understand. Dawn came, or what passed for dawn, and with it, new orders. Advance another 800 meters. Take the next trench line. The cycle beginning again. They brought up fresh conscripts to replace our losses, men who looked exactly like we had 12 hours ago, clean uniforms, full power packs, eyes that still held hope. They took one look at us, at what remained of the 847th Mordian rifles, and that hope died faster than we had. We looked like walking corpses. Our uniforms were more mud and blood than fabric. Our faces were hidden under layers of dirt and dried gore. Our wounds were bound with strips torn from the dead, suppurating through inadequate bandages. Of the 700 who'd left the lander with me, maybe 40 remained. Harkin was one of them, though his twisted arm had been joined by a collection of shrapnel wounds that made him look like he'd been used for target practice. The fresh meat wanted to know what combat was like, what the enemy was like, what their chances were. We didn't answer. There weren't words for what Vraks was. You couldn't explain that the mud was partially composed of the liquefied remains of previous attacks. You couldn't describe the sound a man made when a flamer cooked him inside his flak armor. You couldn't convey that victory meant dying slightly slower than the enemy. The commissar attached to the fresh troops, another young one. They were always young because the old ones were dead, tried to give a motivational speech. Something about glory, about the Emperor's light, about the honor of sacrifice. Halfway through, a sniper's round took off the top of his skull, his brain sliding out like a boiled egg from a broken shell. The fresh troops stared in horror. We didn't even pause in cleaning our weapons. The second assault was worse than the first because we knew what was coming. Knowledge didn't help it, just meant we could anticipate each horror before it arrived. The preliminary bombardment that would catch some in the open no matter how quickly they sought cover. The advance through ground we'd already crossed, now decorated with our own dead from the day before. The Vraxians waiting in positions they'd had years to prepare, while we had hours. This time, the enemy had mining engineers. The first mine went off under a squad of fresh troops, launching them into the air in various pieces. The second caught a group taking cover in a shell crater, turning their shelter into their grave. After that, every step became a gamble. Men tried to step only where others had stepped, creating single-file lines that made perfect targets for the Vraxian gunners. I watched a man freeze completely, unable to take another step, paralyzed by the certainty that his next footfall would be his last. A sergeant shot him for cowardice, and his body fell forward, triggering a mine that killed the sergeant and 2 others. There was a kind of poetry to it, if you'd been on Vraks long enough to appreciate that kind of thing. The trenches, when we reached them, had been modified overnight. The Vraxians had installed new obstacles, razor wire that grabbed at flesh and held you while snipers took their time, stakes driven into the trench floor at angles that would impale anyone who jumped down carelessly. And worst of all, they'd contaminated sections with combat gases that turned exposed skin to jelly. A man named Castellan, I learned his name because he screamed it while dying, got a face full of the gas when he rounded a corner. His features dissolved like ice cream in acid, sliding off his skull while he clawed at his face, trying to hold his flesh in place. His fingernails came off from the frantically scratching, adding to the general dissolution. He lived for 6 minutes that way, his exposed skull still somehow capable of screaming through a throat that was liquefying. We took the second trench line at dusk, having advanced our 800 meters at the cost of another 2,000 lives. The fresh troops were no longer fresh. Those who survived looked like we had after our first day. that particular combination of exhaustion and realization that marked Vraks veterans. One of them, a boy who'd been talking about his girl back home that morning, sat in the muddy water laughing at his own feet, which were no longer attached to his legs but which he'd carefully placed in front of him like boots waiting to be put on. That night, in the captured trench, we discovered what the Vraksians had left for us. Bodies, yes, their own dead mixed with ours from previous assaults. But they'd done something to them, some chemical treatment that made them bloat and rupture at unpredictable intervals, showering anyone nearby with fluids that burned through cloth and flesh. We couldn't remove them without triggering more ruptures, so we lived alongside them, corpse bombs that might go off at any moment. Sleep was impossible and unnecessary. After a certain point, exhaustion transcended into a state where consciousness and unconsciousness blurred together. Men would be talking and suddenly realize they'd been having a conversation with someone who died hours ago. Others would close their eyes and experience hours of combat that hadn't happened yet, or had happened but differently, or was happening continuously in some parallel version of Vraks, where the war never ended. Harkin developed a fever from his wounds, the infection spreading black veins up his arms like a map of corrupted rivers. The Medicae station was 6 trenches back, might as well have been on another planet. I packed his wounds with mud, which sounds insane but was cleaner than the bandages we had. He spent the night talking to his wife, telling her about the home he was going to buy with his guard wages, describing rooms in a house that would never exist for a woman who might already have received his death notice. On the 3rd day, they told us we were being relieved. Not because they valued our lives, but because we were no longer combat effective. The 40 of us who remained from the original 700 couldn't hold a lasgun steady, couldn't see through eyes caked shut with blood and dirt, couldn't follow orders because we'd stopped understanding language as anything but screaming. They needed the trench space for fresh troops who could still pretend they might survive. We marched back through the communication trenches, passing the new arrivals heading to the front. They looked at us with the mixture of horror and pity that we'd once shown to veterans. Now we were the veterans, aged decades in 3 days, carrying the knowledge of exactly how cheaply the Imperium valued their lives. Some of the new arrivals asked questions. We answered with silence, which told them everything. The rear area was supposed to be for rest and recuperation. Instead, it was where men went to die from wounds that hadn't killed them fast enough at the front. The Medicae stations were charnel houses where surgeons who'd given up on anesthesia sawed through limbs with rusty blades, where infections were treated by cutting away flesh until you ran out of flesh to cut, where pain was considered proof you were still alive enough to return to combat. They assigned us to a dugout that had been a command post before a direct hit had killed everyone inside. No one had bothered to remove all the bodies, just the important ones. The rest had been stacked against the walls like sandbags, their decay providing a unique atmosphere that actually improved on the standard Vraks air quality. We sat among the corpses like they were furniture, too exhausted to care about the maggots that dropped from the ceiling or the rats that had grown bold enough to feed while we watched. That night, word came down that our assault had been part of a larger offensive. 50,000 men had attacked across a 20-kilometer front. We'd advanced an average of 600 meters at a cost of 37,000 casualties. High Command declared it a moderate success and ordered preparations for another offensive the next week. Harkin died that night. Not from his wounds, not from the infection, but from what the Medicae called systemic failure. His body had simply decided to stop, shutting down organ by organ, like a machine running out of power. I held his hand as he went, feeling his pulse slow and stop, watching his eyes fix on something beyond the dugout ceiling. His last words were, "Tell them we held the line." I didn't know who them was, or why it mattered that we'd held a line that moved back and forth daily like a tide of meat and metal. But I promised I would, because promises to the dying were the only currency that still had value on Vraks. They buried him in a mass grave with 60 others who died that night, their bodies stacked like cordwood and covered with quicklime that would dissolve them into the soil of Vraks, adding their nutrients to the mud that future conscripts would die in. No markers, no names, no prayers. Just efficiency. The next morning, they declared us combat ready again. There were 31 of us left from the original 847th Mordian rifles. They reinforced us with fresh conscripts until we were back to battalion strength, diluting us among the new arrivals like poison in water. I was promoted to corporal, not for any achievement, but because I was still breathing and could remember my own name, which made me officer material by Vraks standards. The new conscripts looked at my 2-day beard like I was a grizzled veteran. They asked me for advice on surviving. I told them the truth. You don't survive Vraks. You just take longer to die than the others. They laughed, thinking it was gallows humor. They'd learn. The 4th day began with an artillery barrage that turned the air solid with sound and metal. Time on Vraks didn't pass, it accumulated, like sediment at the bottom of a glass, each day adding another layer of horror that compressed the ones below until they became indistinguishable. By my count, I had been on this world for 11 months. By the calendar's count, it had been 13. By my body's count, it had been 40 years. The 847th Mordian rifles had been destroyed and rebuilt 17 times. Each iteration used the same number, the same banners, the same command structure, but the only constant was me and 2 others from the original landing, Thyron, who'd lost his lower jaw to shrapnel and communicated through a slate he carried, and Merrick, whose eyes had been burned out by a phosphor grenade but who'd learned to navigate by sound and smell, which on Vraks was like navigating by different flavors of decay. I was a sergeant now, promoted through attrition rather than merit. My squad consisted of whoever survived the previous day's assault plus whatever fresh bodies arrived on the morning transport. Their faces blurred together into a composite image of youth discovering its own mortality-wide eyes, gradually narrowing, clean shaves becoming wire beards, unmarked skin collecting scars like signatures of survival. The war had evolved since those first days. Not progressed, nothing progressed on Vraks, but evolved. The way bacteria evolve in response to antibiotics. The Vraksians had learned our patterns, our limitations, our breaking points. They'd stopped trying to hold every meter and instead turned the entire world into a machine designed to process human bodies into fertilizer with maximum efficiency. They would give us trenches, let us advance kilometers, then trigger prepared demolitions that would swallow entire companies. They poisoned water supplies with chemicals that didn't kill immediately but caused hallucinations that made men turn on each other. They seeded the mud with bacteria that ate through boot leather and then through feet, leaving soldiers to march on stumps wrapped in rags. We adapted too, in the way that torture victims adapt to pain, not overcoming it but incorporating it into baseline existence. Men learned to sleep standing up in 4-minute intervals between shell bursts. We developed a crude sign language for when the gas attacks made speaking impossible. We stopped naming the new arrivals until they'd survived 3 days, the minimum threshold for being worth remembering. The morning that would become my last began with an unusual event: silence. For 10 minutes, the guns stopped. Not a ceasefire, not a lull, but actual silence that made ears ring with its absence. Men emerged from dugouts like cave creatures experiencing sunlight, looking up at a sky that, for once, wasn't filled with metal death. Some thought it was victory. Others thought it was defeat. The veterans knew it was neither. It was preparation for something worse. The commissar who gathered us that morning was different from the others. Old, for one thing ancient by Vraks standards, with scars that told the story of 20 years of different wars. His uniform was patched with pieces from at least 6 different regiments, and his bolt pistol was held together with prayer seals and wire. When he spoke, it wasn't with the rehearsed fervor of fresh academy graduates, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who'd run out of lies. "Gentlemen," he said, and some of us almost laughed at being addressed as such. "In 1 hour, you will participate in the largest assault of this campaign. 17 regiments, 200,000 men, will advance across a 6-kilometer front." He paused, looking at our faces, seeing recognition dawn. An assault that size wasn't an offensive. It was a funeral, arranged in advance. You will not take your objectives. Most of you will not reach the enemy lines. This is not pessimism, but mathematics. The enemy has had 4 years to prepare these killing fields, and you have had 4 weeks of training. Someone in the back, one of the new arrivals who still had enough spirit to be angry, shouted, "Then why?" The commissar smiled, an expression that looked like a wound on his scarred face. "Because that is what the Guard is for. We are not an army in the traditional sense. We are a measurement, the unit by which the Imperium calculates acceptable losses. Every one of you represents a mathematical equation. How many bodies does it take to hold this line for this many hours? He pulled out a data slate, its screen cracked but functional. The Imperium has 40 million worlds. If each world contributes just 1 regiment per year, that's 40 million regiments. If each regiment is 5,000 men, that's 200 billion soldiers. The enemy, whether Xenos, traitor, or demon, cannot match those numbers. They can kill us by the millions, by the billions, and we will still have more. The silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment. You think you fight for victory, he continued, but the Guard doesn't win wars, we outlast them. We throw bodies at the enemy until they run out of ammunition, until their weapons break from overuse, until they sicken from the diseases our corpses spread. We are not soldiers, we are attrition made flesh. A corporal, braver or more foolish than the rest, asked, "What about glory? What about honor?" Glory is what they call it when you die where you're told to. Honor is what they call it when you don't run. These are words invented to make you feel meaningful while you're being expended. He holstered his pistol, the gesture somehow final. In 40 minutes, you will advance. You will die. Your death will contribute approximately 0.0000001% toward the eventual Imperial victory on Vraks, which itself will contribute approximately 0.000000001% toward the Imperium's continued existence. These numbers are not meant to inspire you. They are meant to prepare you for the truth of your purpose. Someone was crying, one of the new ones who'd arrived that morning, still believing the recruitment lies. The commissar walked over to him, and instead of shooting him for weakness, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tears are appropriate, son. You're mourning yourself. Get it done now, you won't have time once the whistles blow." He left us then, walking toward his own position, his own death. We would learn later that he led the first wave personally and was vaporized by a direct hit from a basilisk shell in the first 30 seconds. His honesty had been his suicide note. We prepared for the assault in silence. There was nothing to say that mattered more than what we'd just heard. We were currency, and we were about to be spent. Some men prayed, though to what God would accept the prayers of currency was unclear. Others wrote final letters they knew would never be delivered. I cleaned my lasgun with mechanical precision, knowing it was meaningless, doing it anyway because routine was the only religion that still made sense. Thyron wrote on his slate, "At least we know." Merrick, blind but somehow seeing more clearly than any of us, said his first words in 3 months. "We always knew. We just preferred the lie." The whistles blew at 600. 200,000 men rose from trenches, dugouts, shell holes, and began walking toward their deaths with the orderliness of a religious procession. The enemy let us advance 100 meters before opening fire, wanting us bunched up, wanting maximum return on their ammunition investment. The killing began with the mathematical precision the commissar had described. Artillery shells deleted entire platoons, leaving only shadows burned into the mud. Heavy stubbers created lanes of death that we walked into because walking around them would break the advance's momentum. Mortars turned men into rain that fell on the ranks behind them. Within 5 minutes, the careful lines had dissolved into a mob, then into scattered groups, then into individuals running through a landscape that had become abstract with destruction. I ran with my squad, what was left of it. Private Castor, 17 years old, 3 days on Vraks, still trying to fix bayonet to his lasgun while running. Corporal Dren, a veteran of 6 months, laughing continuously at some joke only he understood. The others whose names I'd never learned, would never learn, their identities already erased by the certainty of their coming deaths. A shell landed close enough that I felt my organs rearrange from the pressure wave. When I could see again, Castor was trying to stuff his intestines back into his abdomen, apologizing for the mess he was making. Dren had stopped laughing because his head was no longer attached. The unnamed were simply gone, translated into pink mist and memory. I kept running because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding that this was all there was, running toward death because standing still meant death would come to you, and at least this way you could pretend you had agency in your own ending. The Vraksian lines appeared through the smoke like a solid wall of fire. They'd prepared for this assault for weeks, knowing exactly when we'd come, exactly where we'd attack. They'd turned their trenches into industrial killing machines, with interlocking fields of fire that left no dead ground, no cover, no hope. They didn't even need to aim, they just held triggers down and swept their weapons back and forth like gardeners watering rows of plants. I watched a man ahead of me hit by so many rounds that he ceased to exist as a solid object, becoming instead a cloud of organic matter that drifted on the wind. Another tried to take cover in a shell crater and discovered it had been filled with monofila wire that sectioned him into neat cubes as he fell through it. A third made it to the wire obstacles before the enemy line and hung there, crucified on the metal thorns, screaming for his mother in a voice that grew higher and younger as he died. My last gun had been empty for minutes, but I kept pulling the trigger because it gave my hands something to do. Around me, others had given up even the pretense of fighting and were simply walking forward, accepting their deaths with the resignation of slaughterhouse cattle who'd seen the killing floor and understood there was no other destination. The breakthrough, when it came, wasn't tactical genius or heroism, it was simple mathematics. The Vraksians' weapons overheated from killing too many of us too quickly. Their barrels warped, their mechanisms jammed, their ammunition ran low. For 17 seconds, a section of their line couldn't fire, and in those 17 seconds, the mass of our bodies pushed through like water through a broken dam. I found myself in their trench, though I don't remember crossing the final meters. The las gun was gone, replaced by a piece of rebar I'd picked up from somewhere. I was swinging it at anything that moved, connecting with helmets and faces and raised arms, the impacts traveling up the metal and into my arms like notifications of murder. A Vraksian appeared in front of me, young beneath his gas mask, fumbling with a grenade. I drove the rebar through his throat, feeling it scrape against vertebrae before punching through. He dropped the grenade, which rolled between us, its pin already pulled. We looked at each other for a moment, killer and killed, both understanding we were already dead, just arguing about the timeline. The grenade went off. I woke up buried under bodies, though woke up implies I'd been unconscious rather than simply elsewhere for a duration I couldn't measure. My left arm was gone from the elbow down, the stump cauterized by the heat of the explosion. My ears rang with a single note that would never fade. Through gaps in the corpse pile, I could see the battle had moved on, leaving me in that quiet space between the front line and the rear where the dying were left to figure out their own endings. Thyron found me, his slate broken, using hand signals to ask if I could move. I could, though movement had become theoretical, something my body did while my mind observed from a distance. We crawled through trenches filled with dead from both sides, their uniforms making them indistinguishable in death, all reduced to the same fundamental state of unbeing. The counterattack came at dusk. The Vraksians wanted their trenches back, and we were too few, too broken to stop them. I watched from a medical dugout as they retook in 1 hour what had cost us 50,000 lives to capture. The mathematics were elegant in their cruelty. We could take any position if we threw enough bodies at it, but we couldn't hold anything because bodies alone don't hold ground, and bodies were all we were. That night, in the medical station that was more abattoir than hospital, I met the only senior officer I ever saw in Vraks, a colonel, whose name I never learned, whose regiment had been destroyed that morning, who was dying from rad poisoning from a dirty bomb that had detonated in his command bunker. He was lucid in the way the dying sometimes are, his body surrendering but his mind achieving clarity in its final hours. When he saw my stump, he laughed not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. "Lost your arm in a victory, did you?" "We took the trench," I said, "for 6 hours, at the cost of 50,000 men. Do you know what that math means?" I shook my head. "It means the Imperium won, not the battle we lost that. But we proved we're willing to spend 50,000 lives for 6 hours of worthless mud. What enemy can match that insanity? What Xenos empire can look at that and not realize they're going to lose eventually, not through strategy or strength, but through our sheer willingness to die?" He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "The Guard isn't about winning battles. It's about proving that human life has no value to the Imperium except as a resource to be burned. And if life has no value, then death has no cost. And if death has no cost, we can afford to die forever." He died 2 hours later, still talking about mathematics, calculating how many soldiers the Imperium could produce per day versus how many the enemy could kill, proving with numbers that victory was inevitable, even if it took millennia and quintillions of lives. The war continued. It always continued. I was marked for evacuation due to my arm, but the transport was destroyed by orbital bombardment before it could leave. So I stayed, learning to fight with one arm, to reload by holding the lasgun between my knees, to throw grenades by pulling pins with my teeth. The Imperium had no use for a one-armed soldier, but Vraks had use for anything that could still hold a weapon. New regiments arrived daily. The 39th Kandarian Rangers, who lasted 4 days. The 101st Brontine Hellhounds, who lasted 6. The 888th Malkador Martyrs, who lived up to their name in 3. I watched them arrive with hope and die with confusion, unable to understand how the equation that had brought them here could be so simple. They were numbers in a calculation, and their deaths were the solution. Merrick died during a gas attack, his blindness meaning he didn't see the green cloud rolling through the trenches until it was dissolving his lungs. He died laughing, or making sounds that might have been laughter, pointing at where his eyes had been, as if to say he'd seen this coming all along. Thyron lasted another week before a sniper's round found him during morning rations. The bullet entered through his temple and exited through his neck, dropping him into his corpse starch, which continued to steam as his blood mixed with it. His slate fell beside him, the last thing he'd written still visible. Home is a lie we tell ourselves. I was alone then, the last of the original 847th, though the regiment still existed, still received reinforcements, still died, and was reborn daily. Command promoted me to lieutenant, not because I deserved it, but because I was still breathing and could remember tactics from more than 1 day ago. They gave me a platoon of 40 men, whose average age was 18, and whose average life expectancy was 36 hours. I taught them what I could. Not how to survive, that was impossible. Not how to win, that was irrelevant. I taught them how to die correctly, how to make their deaths cost the enemy something, even if that something was just ammunition they'd have to replace. I taught them that they were bullets, and bullets don't question their trajectory. One asked me, a boy named Fevrin, who reminded me of Michael, "Why do we keep fighting if we know we can't win?" "Because," I told him, "that's what the Guard is for. We're not here to win. We're here to exist in the space between the Imperium and its enemies, to be the wall made of meat that stands long enough for someone else, somewhere else, to win a war that matters." "Does any war matter?" he asked. "No," I said, "but pretending they do makes the dying easier." He died the next day, cut in half by an autocannon burst while trying to retrieve a wounded comrade. I didn't learn his replacement's name. The siege entered its 5th year, though time had become meaningless. Vraks had become its own universe, with its own physics where human bodies were currency, death was gravity, and hope was a mental illness treated with bolt rounds. The planet had consumed 20 million Imperial soldiers and showed no signs of satisfaction. New weapons arrived. Super heavy tanks that sank into the mud and became pillboxes until they were destroyed. Aircraft that couldn't fly through the ash-thick atmosphere. Specialized troops who died just as quickly as conscripts, but with better equipment that the enemy could salvage. The Vraksians evolved their tactics again. They stopped defending fixed positions and started trading space for lives, letting us advance into prepared killing zones, then sealing us in and systematically erasing us. They used our own dead against us, rigging corpses with explosives, poisoning burial sites, so that anyone who tried to give last rites would die days later from contact toxins. I survived things that should have killed me. A buried mine that threw me 20 meters but somehow left me intact. A phosphor grenade that burned everything around me but left me untouched in a pocket of unburned air. A bayonet through my chest that missed everything vital by millimeters. Each survival felt less like luck and more like punishment, a cosmic joke that I was condemned to watch everyone else die while I persisted as a witness. The Commissar had been right about the mathematics. By year 5, the Vraksians were running low on everything: ammunition, food, people. Their attacks became desperate, suicidal. They started using child soldiers, criminals, anyone who could hold a weapon. Their trenches began to smell different, not the familiar stench of death but the sour odor of starvation, disease, despair. We were winning by default. Not through tactics or courage, but through simple arithmetic. We had more bodies to throw at the problem than they had bullets to stop them. Every meter we gained cost thousands of lives, but we had millions to spend. It was the most imperial victory imaginable, achieving success through the sheer weight of human suffering. The last offensive I participated in wasn't called an offensive. Command had stopped naming them, just assigned them numbers. This was Assault 1, 847, which by coincidence shared digits with my original regiment. The objective was a fortress that had already changed hands 40 times, each capture and recapture adding another layer of corpses to its foundations. My platoon was down to 12 men. We were attached to a battalion that had been a regiment that morning, would be a company by evening. Nobody gave speeches anymore. The whistles blew, and we advanced because that's what happened when whistles blew. The fortress was defended by Vraksians who looked like us, scarred, exhausted, reduced to the fundamental state of humans who existed only to kill and die. When we reached their lines, the fighting was almost ritualistic. We shot at each other from cover, advanced when ordered, retreated when pushed, died when hit. There was no hatred anymore, just the weary professionalism of workers completing their shifts. I killed a Vraksian officer in hand-to-hand combat, my one arm against his two, both of us too exhausted to fight properly. We ended up wrestling in the mud, trying to drown each other in puddles of liquefied humanity. I won by biting through his throat, tasting blood that was indistinguishable from my own. As he died, he smiled and said in accented low Gothic, "Thank you for ending my shift." We took the fortress as the sun set, planting our banner on walls built from compressed corpses. Command declared it a vital victory. We'd advanced the line 300 meters at the cost of 8,000 lives. By the arithmetic of Vraks, we were winning. That night, sitting in the fortress we'd captured and would lose tomorrow, I finally understood the truth the commissar had tried to tell us. The Guard didn't fight wars, it performed a function. We were the Imperium's proof that it would never run out of lives to spend, that human existence was a renewable resource that could be harvested and replanted indefinitely. Every recruitment parade on every world was a harvest. Every transport ship was a grain silo. Every battlefield was a thresher, separating the wheat from the chaff. Except on Vraks there was no wheat, only different grades of chaff to be burned. The enemy attacked at dawn, as they always did. We defended, as we always did. Men died in patterns that had become so familiar they were almost comforting in their predictability. Shell, scream, silence. Charge, countercharge, collapse. The rhythm of industrial warfare, steady as a manufacturum's production line. I was hit by shrapnel from our own artillery, a miscalculation that dropped shells short of the enemy and into our positions. The metal entered my chest in 3 places, puncturing lungs, nicking arteries, introducing mathematics into my body that didn't add up to survival. As I lay dying, watching new recruits arrive to replace us, fresh-faced boys who believed they were heroes come to win a war, I wanted to tell them the truth. That they weren't soldiers but statistics. That their deaths had already been calculated into acceptable losses. That the Guard would keep feeding Vraks bodies until the planet choked on them. But I stayed silent, because the truth wasn't helpful. They'd learn it themselves, the few who lived long enough. The rest would die believing they mattered, which was a mercy the Imperium accidentally provided. My last coherent thought was about Michael. He'd be old enough to recruit now, might already be on a transport heading to some other world-sized cemetery. I hoped he'd hidden when the parades came through. I hoped he'd remembered my empty letters home, the ones that said nothing because there was nothing to say except, "I'm dying slowly for reasons that don't exist." But hope was just another lie we told ourselves on Vraks. The Astra Militarum doesn't fight wars to win them. It fights wars to prove that human life is the only resource the Imperium will never run out of. And we prove it by dying. Forever. In infinite supply. That's the truth they never tell recruits. You're not joining an army. You're joining an arithmetic problem. And the solution is always the same.